Hi, Jonathan Hedderly here from Psych Cinema and Shrink Tank, and today I'm going to be reviewing Quentin Tarantino's 9th feature film, Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. I'm going to share with you what worked for me, the acting, the ensemble, the storytelling. I'm going to highlight maybe some things that don't work for me or maybe won't work for you in terms of some of the creative decisions that Quentin takes. And then finally, I'm going to give you an overall take on whether it's something you should see or skip. I'm also going to highlight Brad Pitt in particular and ask the question, did Brad Pitt just win his Oscar? Here in a review of Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. So Once Upon a Time in Hollywood really is a love letter to the golden age of cinema, but it takes place in 1969, which most people kind of consider really at the tail end, and they really point to the Charles Manson murders, and specifically of Sharon Tate, as really when the mythological Hollywood scene really came crashing down. And it's a larger cultural scene as well, as we think about the promise of the civil rights in the 60s and free love, and how that really had some dark undertones that Hollywood and all of America really had to face. And that's where this film takes place, really a few months in 1969, and it really follows two key characters. Leonardo DiCaprio plays Rick Dalton, a seasoned television star who really is at the tail end of his career, and his best friend, his stunt double, Cliff Booth, played by Brad Pitt. Now, they are pretty much in every single scene of this film, and they carry it. So let me talk about really what I think works with this film. Here's the good. First and foremost, you know what you're getting with a Quentin Tarantino film. You're going to get sharp dialogue. You're going to get characters that are fully fleshed out. You're going to get this balance of humor, tension, dark undertones, and potential threat of violence. And this film is really Quentin Tarantino's most mature film. This is not a film he could have made 25 years ago when you think about Pulp Fiction, Reservoir Dogs. Although this really does have a lot of the tenderness, the maturity of his 1997 film, Jackie Brown, which we know was not his own source material. And so he's really following somebody else's story and somebody else's characters. This film creates such an immense world of Hollywood 1969 that you get how even the title of this film, Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, it's pointing to a myth, a fantasy, and yet he places you there and he helps you feel like this is really the stuff of dreams. This is a place where people go to pursue their hopes and dreams. And so whether it's the attention to details of the cars, the music, the fashion, you really feel like you're watching a film that maybe was made in 1969. I think the film also works well as a larger commentary on the modern film industry versus right now, because one of the things that as a film lover I notice is that so many of today's successful films have so much CGI, quick cuts. A lot of films today are made in the editing room. And when you think about old television and films, they have these long, drawn-out scenes to where you see somebody really employing all of their physicality and movement into acting and performances. It's not just the ability to deliver lines and then cut and have somebody else deliver their lines. You see in the filmmaking of this film how scenes can go on for 30 seconds, for over a minute, and how it really is about the craft of acting and fully immersive performing. But we can't talk about this film without highlighting the cast. And I just want to take a moment here. I'm going to pull up on IMDb to just talk about the ensemble cast in this movie. You have Margot Robbie. You have Luke Perry, Dakota Fanning, Al Pacino, Timothy Olyphant, Damian Lewis, Kurt Russell, Emile Hirsch, Bruce Dern, James Remar, Michael Martz. I mean, you basically, the cast it endless. And even though this really is a two-man film, each one of these actors have a scene or a moment where they shine and they really add to the overall feel of the immense world of Hollywood and filmmaking. But we can't talk about this film without really highlighting the two central characters, Leonardo DiCaprio's Rick Dalton and Cliff Booth, the character played by Brad Pitt. The chemistry that these two actors have in their friendship and in the film is startling. It really is something to marvel at. Now, we've always known Leonardo DiCaprio is considered one of the greatest actors of his generation, and he has rightly received all the critical awards and praise. But I think Brad Pitt oftentimes is underrated because sometimes he takes on performances that are maybe secondary Maybe his characters are so charming and lighthearted that people take for granted that he's really having to act, and maybe that's just Brad Pitt in real life. He is the point of view, he's the entry point for the audience here, and he does some of his greatest work because even though he can be lighthearted and funny, he has scenes of great tension. He's got scenes that are just flat out funny and startling, and I really do think that this is the opportunity for him to rightly receive the critical praise that he has. Well, let's also talk a little bit about maybe Margot Robbie and maybe some of the things that are problematic or don't work. So here is the bad. Now, coming out of Cannes Film Festival, there was a lot of criticism about Margot Robbie's lack of screen time and dialogue in her portrayal of Sharon Tate, who we know is a real-life actress who's really at the center of the Charles Manson murders. And so then you had Quentin Tarantino defending that the story that he was making, this really wasn't about Sharon Tate. She was populating a larger story in a larger world. And so for some people, if they're looking for more about Sharon Tate and understanding her, are gonna come away frustrated. Now for me, that's not the case because I try my best to review and critique the film that was made rather than what the film could have been. And Sharon Tate and Charles Manson murders, that really represents sort of the clash of cultures that 1969 really represented. So for Sharon Tate, even though she's a real life character, the focus is really on these two fictional characters and what they embody. So Sharon Tate really, in this, she represents what she embodies, which was innocence. Someone at the early end of their career, someone that had all types of potential. She also maybe even represented the movement of more towards feminists and women really having a larger place and influence in popular culture and cinema. And I think Margot Robbie just totally knocks it out of the ballpark in terms of her portrayal of the charm and the likability and the playfulness that Sharon Tate had. Because in a lot of ways, for most people, for most film lovers like myself, Sharon Tate remains an enigma, and she really is a symbol. And I think that this film does its best to try to find that middle ground between humanizing her and giving her real personality and agency, while also recognizing for a lot of people, they know of Sharon Tate because of the Charles Manson murders. And she really represents in a lot of people's minds the end of the golden era of Hollywood and maybe the free love, the hippie movement of the late 60s. I think other people may be disappointed by this really isn't one of Quentin Tarantino's more robust films in terms of staccato, razor-sharp dialogue. He really creates dialogue that fits the characters. And so because these characters really embody 1960s cinema and television, they're not going to talk like a Quentin Tarantino character from the 90s or coming out of let's say, Pulp Fiction or Reservoir Dogs. So there is a lot of humor, but it really has a lot of breathing room. And that's also the beginning of the film. It really has a pretty slow pace to where there's not a lot going on early on because you can tell that Quentin just likes these characters that he's created. And he wants to give them some breathing room to tell their stories and to immerse the viewer into the 1960s Hollywood. So some people may be a little bit bored early on. I didn't find that a problem myself. And so again, even though these are things that maybe other people have problems with, I certainly didn't. The other thing I want to mention without spoiling, that maybe is a later video, is the climactic scene where it really comes to a head in terms of the night where Charles Manson's followers really went on a murdering spree, and Sharon Tate, who I believe at the time was 8 months pregnant, was one of their victims. This scene is going to be immensely controversial. I suspect it's going to be polarizing. I did not have a problem with the scene. I don't know overall how I feel about it, but I didn't leave with any type of disgust or contempt. More than anything, I was just shocked at the audacity of Quentin Tarantino and the choices that he made, and it really threw me off in a way that I was enthralled, I was bewildered, and I think most film goers are gonna come out of the climax feeling the same way, even if some of the elements and decisions he makes in terms of how he tackles history, some people might find problematic. So now, with all that in mind, let's talk a little bit about whether or not this is a skip it or see it, whether this movie is for you or not. And for me, this is a 1000% see it. I think Quentin Tarantino is a brilliant filmmaker. I also think he is a problematic filmmaker, and he's one of those celebrities and artists that I think it's okay to highlight their genius while also calling out some of the more troubling or problematic aspects of their filmography. But in a lot of ways, I think this film may be one of his most mature films, one of his most restrained films. I think it's one of his funniest films. And hopefully a lot of viewers will come out of this film having some of the least amount of problems that you might have in other films of Quentin Tarantino. This really is not a very violent film, something you don't necessarily expect from a Quentin Tarantino movie. I think all of the performances are charming. Margot Robbie, Leonardo DiCaprio just solidifies his ranking as probably the greatest actor of his generation. But again, I cannot emphasize enough how much Brad Pitt holds his own in this film, and he brings, I think, a lot more of that lighthearted charm and humor, which again really sets the viewer up for the ominous ending, which we know is coming for those of you that are familiar with the timeline and the Charles Manson murders and Sharon Tate. But overall, I highly recommend this movie. I'm curious to hear from you. If you are a Quentin Tarantino lover, did this film work for you despite some of its restraint and the maturity, or were you hoping for even more outlandish, outrageous kind of decisions and filmmaking techniques from Quentin Tarantino? What did you think about the ending? Without spoiling it necessarily for audiences or people that haven't seen it yet, did it work for you, or were you offended or objected to the primary principle of the artistic license that Quentin Tarantino made? Be sure to just leave me your comments below. You can also leave a recommendation of a film you'd like for me to review here on Shrink Tank. That's going to do it for today. Until next time, I'm Jonathan Hedderly. Thanks for watching. We'll see you at the movies.